The Bible begins in a very dramatic way. In the beginning, God. Genesis is a book about God. Israel is on the verge of the promised land, and it is like Moses is giving them a motivational speech. And he begins by looking at God and how God created the world. Verse 1 is the theme for this chapter. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Those are 7 Hebrew words, and those 7 Hebrew words are the foundation for everything that follows in the Bible. And the main point to take away from what it says about the way God created the world has to do with his absolute supremacy and power. The Bible begins by putting God in a position all by himself. There is God and there is everything else. There is the creator and there is the created. Those are 2 different categories. And when we look at God's creation of the universe, we see that he is exalted far above everything he has created. And he has more than enough power to do exactly what he has said he would by his word. The expression God said is found 10 times. God, God, God. The agent of creation is never in doubt. In fact, to see how powerful God is, let's compare what we learn about him in this text with the very next biggest thing, and that is the universe itself. Feel this. We read it so quickly, but think about the massiveness of the universe. If he created it, then he existed before it. There was a time when there was nothing but God. God has no ancestors. He has no family tree. He is self-existent. If he created it, he is not it. In Moses' day, that was hard for people to understand. They thought parts of the creation were God's. The sun, the moon, they thought were God's. But the God of the Bible exists outside of creation. There are only 2 kinds of things in the universe. There is that which is created, and there is the one who is not. God is in a category all by himself, which is obviously why we can say if he created the world, he's more important than the world. And certainly he is more powerful than anything in it. The universe is a sign of the unique power of God. One of the interesting things to do is to compare this creation account with other creation accounts that existed in Moses' time. Obviously, Moses wasn't the only one to explain where the universe came from. Others were doing that as well. And while there are some similarities in the accounts, there are some pretty big differences as well. There are more differences than there are similarities, for sure. For example, one late Babylonian tale, Numa Elish, it was a tale about Babylonian gods, specifically Marduk, and how he defeats the forces of chaos in a very graphic way. And he uses this defeated god of chaos and makes sky and land. And later on in the story, the gods get tired, and so they kill another one of the gods, and they slit his throat, and they pour his blood onto the ground, mixing the blood and dirt to make humans. So life in this creation account is born out of some violent conflict among the gods. And out of that, Marduk establishes his kingdom, which I think you can see is very different from the Genesis account. As someone has put it, Israel stands alone in claiming that a single God created all that exists, and he didn't have a hard time doing it. In verse 1, God creates all the material, and in verse 2 and following, he begins to fashion that material. Verse 1 sets the stage. Verse 2 narrows the focus and starts getting more specific about how God went about creating his great creation. And we've got this world that is formless and empty, and you have darkness that's upon the land, and the land is covered with water. And the author is telling us this was what it was like before God made it good. Before God began his work, the land was formless and empty, and then God made it good. So it's like he's answering the question, how did the earth go from being without form and empty to this beautiful place we enjoy? It's God. As we read this chapter, we're going to see that God is the subject of almost every verb. He's presented like an artist here, and he's designing the land for our maximum benefit. 35 times the name of God is used, and he's the subject of each verb. The essential feature is the command of God. To show his rule over creation, he gives it names. That's what a name is. It's a demonstration of authority. That's why kings renamed captives. And what we see in Genesis 1 is that God is not only the creator of the world, he is the king. Clearly, God is depicted as a royal figure in this 7-day narrative. He speaks and things happen. Ancient readers would have looked at what is going on here and said, this is God acting like a king. Kings speak and things happen. They had authority and people did what they said. Build me a pyramid, and they build a pyramid. In the same way, God speaks and things happen. Creation obeys the commands of God. And so at the very beginning, we're seeing there's only one God, and there's no higher authority than him in the universe. He's the one who's taking this world and turning it into something beautiful. For what? What is he doing all this creating and designing for? He's creating it as a good place for man to live and enjoy his presence. Genesis 1 is a very carefully constructed passage, and it's all leading to something. One man writes, this text clearly has a goal to which everything is directed, namely the creation of humanity on the sixth day. We see a number of hints that humanity is the goal of creation throughout this text. You have the difference in the way the creation of man is introduced, for one. It's almost like, as you read through Genesis chapter 1, it just slows down and pauses in a sense. God starts speaking poetry, and you have this threefold repetition of the Hebrew word for create in verse 27. There's a build-up, and it's a build-up to the grand finale of creation on the events of the sixth day. It's like what's happening in days 1 to 5. God, the Creator, is preparing the land as a home. It is good. It is good. It is good. For what? It is a good place for my people to live. God is making this amazing world, and then he sets man down in the middle of it, whom he intends to use as a means of blessing for his creatures. It is a privilege to be a human being. There is something glorious God is doing with us. We are not God. We are a created being, but we are not like everything else in creation either. We are made in the image of God, and we need to see the glory that is involved in being a human. And that is part of the purpose of this text. As we're looking at this passage, God's creating all these things, and it's very quick. But in Genesis 1, 26 to 28, God slows down. It's the longest scene in the creation narrative. It's the first poem in the Bible. And in it, God says that he's making man in his image and likeness. This highlights the uniqueness of man. We alone are made in the image of God. We're like everything else in that we're creatures, but we're unlike everything else in that we have been made in the image of God. And this idea of being made in the image of God is very important. But what does it mean? What does it mean? We're going to look at what it means for man to be made in the image of God in our next video.